Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're starting with what might just be the single most defining concept in the source material, but one that is so often misunderstood. We're talking about the ultimate transgression.
We have a pretty extensive stack of analyses here, all on the topic of shirk, which is the act of associating partners with the Creator.
And the foundational question is really inescapable, isn't it? What is the gravest error a human soul can commit? And more importantly, why is that error set apart from all others?
Exactly. And our mission today is to move past some of the simpler theological definitions and really engage in a rigorous, rational, and legal critique of shirk to explore precisely why it's considered the most profound failure possible.
And the gravity of it is established right away. This isn't something left open to interpretation. We see these solemn declarations, for example, in Surah An-Nisa, which state very explicitly that the Creator does not forgive association with him, but he forgives what is less than that for whom he wills.
That is the ultimate statement of a boundary. And you should think of it less as an arbitrary rule and more like a mathematical truth.
How so?
Well, all other sins, personal failings, moral mistakes, errors in judgment, they're all presented as negotiable, correctable. They fall into the umbrella of divine mercy, but only if the foundation remains sound.
But shirk is different.
Shirk is the singular transgression that cuts the root of that relationship entirely. It breaks the foundation itself.
The sources frame this severity perfectly, I think. Why is this one error placed completely outside the framework of forgiveness? And the answer seems to be that attempting to mix the pristine, unambiguous truth of the divine law with human falsehood, or worse, with human authority, is defined as an inevitable, complete failure of the entire system of life.
That's a great way to put it. You can't mix clean water with a potent poison and expect a beneficial outcome. It just doesn't work. The system itself is compromised.
And it's so crucial to understand the existential weight of this declaration. This isn't just academic theology we're discussing.
No, not at all. It's a practical architecture for life. Understanding shirk is really about cultivating a direct, unmediated, and purified relationship with the Creator. The moment you introduce an intermediary or some kind of secondary authority, you fundamentally compromise the integrity of your intention and really your entire framework for action.
So if the gravity is so profound that it invalidates the very mechanism of forgiveness, we have to pivot immediately to the rational architecture that explains it. Why is this so severe? Let's talk about shirk as a systemic failure, this idea of the usurpation of sovereignty.
Exactly. And to do that, we have to start with the concept of Tawhid.
Right, a term that is constantly simplified in common discourse to just mean monotheism, believing in one God.
But the sources define it far more precisely and much more powerfully. They define it as legislative sovereignty.
Okay, let's unpack that. What's the fundamental difference between just, believing in one God and accepting his legislative sovereignty?
The difference is vast. Legislative sovereignty means recognizing that the Creator alone is the ultimate lawgiver, the ultimate source of authority, or umjer.
So his revelation, the Quran, must be the only acceptable basis for all forms of law and governance.
Yes, for everything, political, social, moral, economic. It establishes this absolute singularity of authority, which the sources call hakimiyya.
Okay, so if Tawhid is this singular, non-negotiable sovereignty, then shirk becomes the ultimate act of legislative rebellion. This really shifts the concept, doesn't it? It moves from being a ritual mistake to a functional legal crime against the entire cosmos.
Precisely. Shirk occurs the moment humanity delegates that supreme law-giving authority, that amount, to any created entity.
And this can be visual things like rulers or political systems or historical idols.
Of course. But it's often more subtle. It can be internal. It could be unquestioned, entrenched traditions, the prevailing ideologies of a culture, or even just our own unrestrained, selfish desires, what the sources call the nafs.
So let's take a practical example. A political body enacts a law concerning, say, banking legalizing usury, which the divine law explicitly prohibits, and they enforce that as the supreme law of the land. In that moment, that society is performing shirk.
Absolutely. By consciously accepting and enforcing a human-made law that stands in direct contradiction to the divine law, that society has effectively usurped the Creator's sovereignty, the hakimiyya.
So it's elevating a human partner, a parliament, a court, an economic theory, to a divine, ultimate law-giving status.
Yes, and crucially, this renders the system polytheistic in practice, regardless of what theological statements people might be reciting in their houses of worship.
This analysis gives us that profound, rational reason for the severity of shirk. It's not just a breach of command, it's a catastrophic failure of the entire mechanism of justice.
And this brings us to three interlocking reasons why it's unforgivable, all based on this idea of systemic failure. The first is the fundamental destruction of the foundation. The divine system is structured upon justice, or adl. So if the singular source of truth, Tawhid, is compromised by introducing fallible, self-interested human partners into the legislative process, then the entire structure becomes fundamentally and irreversibly corrupt.
You can't build justice on a foundation of compromise. It's structurally impossible.
Exactly. And if the system is corrupt from the base level, it leads directly to the second reason, voluntary self-exclusion.
Okay, so help us clarify the difference between a sin within the system and a sin that's against the system itself.
All other sins, let's say personal theft, dishonesty, acts of immorality, these are failures within the system. The person who commits them still, in principle, accepts the supreme authority of the divine law.
Which means they have a pathway back, repentance or tauba, correction.
Right. They can reform their actions and still align themselves with the guiding principle because the principle itself is intact for them.
But shirk is the radical rejection of the source of correction itself.
Precisely. You have consciously accepted human authority over divine law. You've voluntarily removed yourself from the only pathway to spiritual and ethical recovery. It's like sawing off the branch you were sitting on. Recovery is rationally impossible until that foundational error is dismantled.
And that leads to the third and maybe the most visible consequence, why shirk is labeled the tremendous sin.
Because it inevitably leads to societal zulm. And zulm isn't just oppression. It's systemic imbalance, it's darkness, it's the violation of human rights. The sources trace every large-scale injustice, economic exploitation, tyranny, corruption, back to a human authority that legislated based on temporary self-interest instead of the Creator's balanced, immutable law.
When human desires become the source of law, injustice is guaranteed, because human desire is inherently biased.
That's it. And that is the perfect rationalization for the contrast with all other sins. We can circle back to that quote. He forgives what is less than that for whom he wills. This affirms the Creator's absolute, overwhelming mercy for moral failings.
As long as they don't compromise the ultimate law-giving authority.
The brilliance here is the reassurance. As long as Tawhid is intact, as long as an individual or a society accepts the supreme, singular authority of the divine law, the framework for justice remains. It's always available for reform.
The person can still repent, correct their actions, and realign with the system because the blueprint for correction still holds true for them.
Yes, shirk is the only failure that fundamentally invalidates that contract of trusteeship, the Khalifa, and in doing so, it destroys the rational mechanism of salvation itself.
So moving on from that, this foundational truth of legislative sovereignty, it establishes the priority of divine law and the ethical structure required for any human society. You mentioned that Tawhid is the precondition for all sound ethics. Let's look at the analysis of Surah Al-An'am.
Yes, 6.151. It's structurally fascinating. It lists a whole series of essential ethical and social commandments, but it places the prohibition of shirk absolutely first.
He commands that you not associate anything with him, and to parents, good treatment, and do not kill your children for fear of poverty. The list flows from that premise.
Yes, from the legislative premise to the social consequences.
So why is something like treating your parents well or providing for your children, why is that secondary to rejecting shirk?
It's about the structural significance. If the source of law is corrupted by shirk, then all the subsequent ethical and economic laws will inevitably be distorted.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Let's say human tradition, a form of shirk, dictates that a son must follow his parents' destructive business practices even if they go against the divine law. In that case, filial piety becomes a mechanism of oppression.
Ah, I see. So securing that singular, incorruptible source of justice, the divine law, is a rational prerequisite for building any sound social structure where even basic ethics can flourish without being twisted by self-interest or tradition.
Exactly. And that structural need for purity is then given this universal application, and it's exemplified by the figure of the Messiah in Surah Al-Ma'idah. This isn't just used as a historical reference, but as proof of the universality of this legislative principle.
It's an exceptionally powerful theological guardrail. It proves that no created being, not an angel, not a prophet, not a saint, not even the Messiah, can possess legislative sovereignty.
That's right. The Messiah himself, according to the source, commanded pure Tawhid. O children of Israel, worship Allah, my Lord and your Lord. He directs his submission away from himself and points it toward the ultimate source of all law.
So the condemnation then focuses not on the Messiah, but on those who elevated him, making him an object of ultimate trust and submission, a functional partner in authority. And the consequence for that legislative error is stated clearly. Allah has forbidden him paradise, and his refuge is the fire.
And from a systemic perspective, what that means is that systemic peace, harmony, success, whether you define paradise as a perfection of the hereafter or a just civilization on earth, it is rationally incompatible with shirk.
A society that builds its governance or its creed on submitting to the flawed will of a created being is logically bound to generate conflict and injustice.
Which is the very definition of the fire, the consequence of chaos and broken order.
This brings us to a more precise legal definition of shirk in Surah Al-Araf, where it's grouped directly with immoralities, sin, and oppression. This suggests a very specific type of violation.
It does. It details the transgression as associating partners, that for which he has not sent down authority, or sultan. And sultan here is key. It means a legitimate, verifiable warrant or proof.
So shirk is, by definition, an act of legislative innovation inventing laws, doctrines, rituals, or ethical standards without any legitimate warrant, without that sultan from the divine revelation.
Yes, and that legal failure is immediately tied to an intellectual failure in the very same verse. And that you say about Allah that which you do not know.
Which is the direct antithesis of the human mandate to use knowledge and reason, or aql. When you invent a law without authority, you are speaking about God's will from a position of profound, verifiable ignorance.
You're claiming knowledge that you cannot possibly possess. It's a total overreach.
So shirk is presented as this comprehensive failure, a kind of triad, willful oppression, or zulm, which is caused by unauthorized legislation, which is then defended by intellectual ignorance. It completely dismantles the basis for a just and rational civilization.
It connects all the dots perfectly. The moment you introduce an unauthorized, non-divine source of law into the system, you introduce ignorance. And that ignorance guarantees injustice. The system just collapses structurally, intellectually, and morally.
So if those are the external legal definitions, we need to move inward to the metaphysical necessity of it all. We have to explore the rational architecture of the Creator's being that makes shirk not just illegal, but logically impossible. And for that, we have to break down Surah Al-Ikhlas. This is the core logical defense of Tawhid.
This chapter establishes why absolute singularity is a necessity for the universe's order and coherence. It moves beyond just belief and into logical proof.
Okay, so let's start with the first part. One, or Yavid, absolute singularity. How does the source material justify this?
The argument is purely rational. The source reminds us that if there were multiple ultimate authorities, multiple lawgivers, their wills and laws would eventually conflict.
They would compete for control.
Inevitably. And that would lead directly to the destruction of the universal order. There's a reference to this in Surah Al-Anbiya. If there were gods besides Allah in the heavens or earth, they would both have been ruined.
So unity is the condition for cosmic coherence. The universe's observable organization, its perfect and predictable systemic laws, those are the physical proofs of this singular legislative authority. Any attempt to introduce duality into the ultimate command structure would just result in chaos.
Then you have the next attribute, eternal refuge, or as-samad, the self-sufficient one.
And this is crucial because it negates any possible need for partners or helpers or external mechanisms to manifest his will.
Exactly. If the Creator required assistance or collaboration or validation, he would be dependent, and therefore not the ultimate singular lawgiver. Dependence compromises sovereignty.
And finally, the last part. No equivalent, or kufuwan. This is really the definition of impossibility.
Because no created entity, not a human, not an angel, not an economic theory or an ideology, can possess the necessary attributes of singularity, independence, and self-sufficiency. So attempting to find an equivalent legislative or worship partner is a rational absurdity.
It's like trying to pair the finite with the infinite, the dependent with the independent.
Precisely. So shirk is not only forbidden, it is futile. It's based on a fundamental logical fallacy about the nature of ultimate reality. You are trying to partner the independent, self-sufficient source with something that is utterly dependent and created.
And this logical flaw, it immediately manifests itself in profound socio-psychological weakness, which we see analyzed in Surah Al-Baqarah, describing those who take equals, or andad, alongside the Creator.
And these equals are defined very widely. This is where the relevance really hits home for us today.
Right, they're not just wooden idols. They can be anything. A charismatic political leader, a national ideology, a cult of personality, or even just personal material desire. Anything that is granted absolute devotion and obedience. The sources say people love them as they should love Allah.
And this misplaced devotion is identified as the source of all human-initiated tyranny and self-harm. It speaks to that intrinsic human weakness for attributing power to temporary, visible authority.
Those who commit shirk are often deluded by the temporary power or the false certainty offered by human leaders or ideologies.
Yes, they see the force of a tyrant or the appeal of a dominant political or economic structure, and they grant it ultimate submission, hoping for security or gain.
But the reality, the rational declaration, is that all power, gua, belongs to Allah. This is a law-based statement. True, consistent, predictable power is only vested in the fixed laws of the Creator, the Sunnat Allah, which are immutable and eternal.
Any human power, any undad that tries to legislate outside that framework is inherently temporary, fragile, and ultimately destined to collapse. Its eventual failure is proof of its inherent weakness.
The believer's love, on the other hand, is described as stronger because it's vested in that unbreakable foundation of divine law, which never fails, never collapses, and operates with perfect consistency.
That strength is derived from submitting to certainty, not to temporary human whim.
So if the metaphysical necessity establishes the impossibility of partners, then the next section has to define the practical boundary of human authority, especially when it comes to revered figures and tradition. We have to reject man-made systems and false authorities. Let's start with the human limitation of the messenger in Surah Al-Kahf.
Yes, the declaration. Say, I am only a man like you to whom has been revealed that your God is one God. This is an incredibly crucial, rational guardrail established from the very outset.
Why is that declaration so vital for the concept of Tawhid?
Because it prevents the messengers themselves from being elevated to the status of a divine partner. If the messenger had claimed divinity or some kind of co-legislative power, the entire system of Tawhid would have failed on day one.
So, by asserting his humanity, he safeguards the principle. His function is purely to convey the divine law, not to become a co-legislator or a secondary source of sovereignty.
Exactly. The focus remains entirely on the message, the law, and not on the messenger's person.
Which means associating partners in worship here is far more than just a ritual act toward a human figure. It means absolute obedience and submission to a human authority that contradicts or usurps the Creator's law. That is a rejection of man-made systems built around these charismatic figures.
And that boundary is then applied to the structure of governance itself in Surah Al-Jinn regarding the masjid. The common understanding is often just limited to a building.
But the interpretation our sources offer is that the masjid, the place of complete submission, or sajda, is the center of the community's legislative and spiritual life. It is the sovereign space where ultimate loyalty and submission are pledged.
Therefore, the decree, the masjids are for Allah, so do not invoke with Allah anyone, is a command that the governing principles of the community, which emanate from the center of submission, must be derived exclusively from divine law.
So it's a demand for absolute political and spiritual monotheism, a profound call for pure governance.
Yes, it commands the community leaders, the Khalifa, to establish a system where arbitrary human rule, political partisanship, or sectarian divisions have no polytheistic influence. The system must be singular, directed entirely by the immutable divine commands, rejecting all man-made laws that clash with it.
This demand for systemic purity brings us to one of the most intellectually critical discussions: the legislative shirk found in non-revelatory books that become central to historical religions. The principle here is that accepting human-authored texts as co-equal or equally binding law violates the exclusive sovereignty of the Creator.
This is a delicate area, but one where the sources are meticulously clear on the mechanism of failure. The first category they identify is within Judaism, specifically the reliance on the Talmud.
Okay, so the original divine law, the Torah, is acknowledged.
Yes, but the subsequent development of the oral law, which was compiled in the Talmud, that vast collection of rabbinic discussions, legal rulings, and interpretive traditions, it becomes the dominant basis for Jewish civil and religious law.
And where does the shirk manifest in that?
The shirk arises when the legal authority of the Talmud is functionally given equal or even surpassing status to the written law. This elevates the collective human legal tradition of the rabbis' centuries of interpretation and commentary to a co-legislative status alongside the singular perfect law of the Creator. It's an elevation of human derivation over divine instruction.
Then we analyze Christianity, where the foundational texts of the New Testament, the Gospels and the Epistles, especially those of Paul, are not singular revelation, but are post-revelatory human accounts and interpretations.
and they are acknowledged by the source material as human-written biographies and personal letters. The legislative shirk happens when the authority of these narratives and letters is elevated to the level of defining core creedal doctrines, like the Trinity or the exact divine nature of Jesus.
Doctrines that, according to the sources, fundamentally violate Tawhid by associating partners with God based on human compilation rather than singular, verified divine command.
Precisely. And finally, the analysis turns inward to historical Islam, specifically the vast hadith compilations and the subsequent sunnah, or traditional practice, that developed over centuries.
And the critique here is nuanced but firm.
Yes, when these massive collections of attributed sayings and actions of the Prophet compiled long after his death are treated as a source of legislation co-equal to the Quran, they constitute a form of legislative shirk.
Because it violates that principle we just discussed, that the messenger was merely the first perfect servant of the law, not a co-legislator whose every personal action or attributed saying is binding law, especially if it contradicts the primary revelation.
So in all three cases, the Talmud, the Gospels and Epistles, and the Hadith compilations, the other books, represent human effort, historical recording, commentary, legal derivation. When they're placed on the pedestal of co-equal authority alongside the single divine revelation, they result in the very legislative rebellion that the Quran warns against.
The common thread is the subtle and often unintentional substitution of perfect, divine authority with fallible, human-derived authority, which brings us to a related intellectual failure: blind following, or taqlid, and the abdication of reason, aql.
And before discussing the failure, the sources reestablish the context.
Sure.
The universe itself mandates the use of intellect.
Right. Surah al-Baqarah paints this picture. The alternation of night and day, the ships sailing the seas, the rain reviving the land, all these are described as clear signs for those who use their intellect. Aql.
The universe isn't chaotic. It's governed by intelligent, fixed, verifiable laws. Therefore, humanity, as the Khalifa entrusted with its care, must use reason to navigate it and, critically, to legislate justly. The existence of an intelligently ordered universe sets the stage for judging our legislative and intellectual choices.
And against this mandate for intelligent engagement, we find the crime of taqlid in that same chapter, the refusal to follow revelation in favor of ancestral ways. This is such a common defense. Nay, we will follow the ways of our ancestors.
This is a voluntary abdication of the supreme gift of human reason. The Khalifa was appointed because of this unique capacity for aql, so to reject the clear, accessible divine revelation, a source of demonstrable certainty, in favor of an unverified ancestral tradition is a profound intellectual failure.
It's choosing dogma over documented proof.
Yes, and the rhetorical question that immediately follows is the most damning critique. What? Even though their ancestors were lacking in understanding and were not rightly guided. This highlights that taqlid is a conscious choice to prefer demonstrable ignorance over revealed certainty.
And that intellectual failure translates immediately into legislative shirk. When a human tradition, a family custom, a tribal law, a sex-specific ruling dictates action over a clear divine command, that tradition is being elevated to a position of sovereignty or hakimiyya.
You are effectively granting legislative partnership to deceased, potentially unguided human beings, and you're displacing the Creator's command with fallible human history.
And since those ancestors were potentially unguided, their traditions inevitably contained elements of error, injustice, or prejudice zulm.
And by blindly following those errors, the current generation is perpetuating oppression, refusing to reform their laws according to the perfect, just divine law. Taqlid just perpetuates systemic failure.
The consequence of this mindless submission is articulated in the severe spiritual verdict that follows. It's a powerful, almost tragic metaphor.
The likeness of the blind follower, the adherent of taqlid, is compared to a herd of sheep, hearing the divine call as nothing more than a sound and a shout. They hear the physical vibration of the words, but they distinguish no meaning, no instruction, and derive no guidance from it.
So taqlid is defined as operating at a subhuman level of existence. By refusing to engage in intellectual analysis, to question, to verify, to synthesize, the father reduces their cognitive function to that of a beast, merely reacting to noise instead of processing information.
This intellectual paralysis is the predictable outcome of prioritizing tradition over the use of reason. It's the ultimate failure to use the very gift that separated humanity from the animal kingdom, rendering them deaf, dumb, blind, for they do not use their reason.
The moment reason is abandoned, the path to legislative shirk just opens wide, because falsehood can no longer be rationally identified and refuted.
Which brings us from the legislative and intellectual forms of shirk to the more deeply cultural and spiritual manifestations, the futility of proxies, intercessors, and superstitions. This is where we address reliance on graves, saints, and charms.
And this reliance on proxies is fundamentally an attempt to find a loophole in the system of personal responsibility. It's a rejection of the direct contract the Creator established with the Khalifa.
Right. If you can delegate the consequences of your choices to an intercessor, then your personal moral effort, your amal salih, it becomes unnecessary.
This delegation is directly condemned in Surah Al-Kahf, which rejects taking the Creator's servants as allies, or awliya, those granted unauthorized intermediary power.
And reliance on these proxies is condemned because the Creator has provided direct access to guidance and requires direct personal effort. The consequence hell being prepared is not just a punishment, it's the logical outcome of a system built on arbitrary intercession rather than divine law and individual accountability. It breaks that rational chain of cause and effect that the Creator system established.
But the sources go even further, using pure rational logic to dismantle the theological basis for seeking intercession from the deceased. The section in Surah Fatir is a perfect example of this rational proof of impotence.
Yes, this passage establishes an absolute, non-negotiable divide between fundamental, observable opposites: the blind and the seeing, darkness and light, the cooling shade and the scorching heat. The sources are demanding we choose truth based on intellect and observable reality.
And this rigorous, almost scientific framework leads directly to the core statement: nor are the living equal with the dead. How does this simple physical observation dismantle the practice of seeking intercession from graves or saints?
Because the dead are physically absent. They possess no sensory function to perceive the prayers, requests, or needs of the living. To believe that a deceased human can hear, respond, and act on your behalf is a rejection of manifest physical law, the Sunnat Allah, which the Creator himself ordained.
And there's a profound spiritual warning there, too. If even the prophet cannot make the dead of heart, those who spiritually refuse the truth hear, how can anyone expect those in the graves to hear?
Spiritual deadness and physical death are linked by their inability to engage with and act upon the truth.
This idea of rational futility is reinforced by what the sources call the intercession fallacy, detailed in Surah Yunus. People reject the fixed, immutable nature of the divine law, and so they search for loopholes through proxies. They say, these are our intercessors with God.
They want a system of accountability that can be bypassed. So they invent objects or figures, graves, relics, idols that possess no active, independent power to affect the fixed laws of the universe. Worshipping them or relying on them is logically and practically useless.
And then comes the ultimate rational challenge, the omniscience challenge. Are you informing God of what he does not know in the heavens and earth? This just exposes the core logical flaw in shirk.
The very need for an intercessor implies that the Creator requires persuasion, or is somehow unaware of human needs and affairs, which completely contradicts his defined attributes of omniscience, perfection, and infinite mercy. It's an intellectual contradiction that proves the absurdity and the inherent futility of this form of shirk. If God is all-knowing, you don't need a spokesperson.
Okay, let's shift to the folly of hidden forces, starting with the functional definition of jinn in the sources. This moves the discussion away from pure superstition and into the realm of intellectual responsibility.
Yes, the sources define jinn not necessarily as supernatural entities, but in two very tangible ways. Either as secluded humans, nomadic, tribal people outside organized society who often operated under their own volatile laws, or as hidden forces and phenomena like microbes or unknown natural mechanisms that challenge humanity to use reason and science to uncover them.
So, shirk, in this context, would be seeking refuge in unstable, non-codified human factions, the quick-tempered jinn over the codified stability of divine law.
Exactly. And Surah al-Jinn confirms the rational consequence. Seeking refuge in unstable human factions only increase them in burden. The only reliable refuge is the perfectly ordered system of the Creator's laws, which provides stability and predictability. Reliance on chaos inevitably brings more chaos.
We can apply this same logic to astrology and fortune-telling. These practices are condemned as claiming a divine prerogative knowledge of the unseen, the Kaab.
Yes, the sources establish the Creator's exclusive domain over the Kaab. So believing in these practices is a form of intellectual slavery. It replaces rational planning, hard work, and ethical choice with deterministic fatalism.
And it is shirk because it attributes omniscience and control over destiny to a created entity, be it stars, tea leaves, or psychics, leading the trustee, the Khalifa, away from the true sovereign source of power.
And the final word on the folly of hidden power, objects and relics, is delivered through that pure rational test of impotence in Surah Al-Hajj, the fly analogy.
This is perhaps the most concise and devastating proof of logical shirk. The challenge is universal. All invoked deities or relics combined will never create as much as a fly. They lack the fundamental sovereignty over life, matter, and the physical processes of regeneration.
And the test of agency is even more powerful. If a fly should steal away from them a tiny thing, they could not recover it from him. They possess no creative power, and critically, they possess no active agency to protect or recover what is theirs.
The logical conclusion, weak are the pursuer and pursued, confirms that reliance on falsehood makes the devotee weak by choice.
You're relying on an inert, powerless object instead of submitting to the single, all-powerful lawgiver who provides true strength through obedience to his perfect system.
That sets the stage perfectly for discussing the most subtle forms of shirk, the corruption of the divine word itself, where the law is stripped of its intended function and treated as a source of hidden material power.
Let's analyze magic, or sir, as deceptive influence in Surah Al-Baqarah. Magic is defined as a form of disbelief, kufr, because it attempts to co-opt a false source of sovereignty by exerting hidden, unauthorized influence outside the ethical framework of divine law.
And the source is defined, sir, primarily as deceptive influence, manipulating perception, belief, and behavior through suggestion, hypnotism, or clever tricks, rather than some inexplicable supernatural power that violates God's natural laws.
Exactly. The knowledge behind it is given as a trial. It is knowledge that can be used for good, like understanding hidden psychological mechanisms, but when it's corrupted, it becomes a tool for antisocial behavior and self-interest.
But the key phrase that strips magic of all independent primary power is, "But they do not harm anyone through it except by permission of Allah."
This is the definitive rational statement. It confirms that the magical effect is not a violation of the Creator's laws, but a temporary manifestation permitted through them, by exploiting natural, psychological, or material mechanisms that God established.
So magic is still subordinate to the Creator's overarching system, the Sunnat Allah. It's exposed as exploiting human weakness and superstition, creating the illusion of causality where none truly exists outside of God's overall fixed laws.
This brings us to a pervasive and very subtle corruption of revelation found in practices like wearing Tawhid amulets and drinking dissolved verses. This is a systemic corruption where the divine word is degraded into a magical object or a chemical compound.
It is a profound intellectual and spiritual failure. The Quran is defined as instruction, guidance, and healing for what is in the breasts: doubt, injustice, sectarianism. The cure is moral and spiritual correction achieved through understanding and implementation of the law, not ritual consumption.
But when verses are worn as a passive charm, the Tawiz, the function is immediately reduced from a comprehensive guide for social living, a constitution, to a personal static lecharm.
And in the case of dissolved verses, the trustee is treating the divine word as a chemical or medicinal compound, implying the power lies in the physical ink or paper in inert matter. This is the very definition of subtle shirk, attributing primary agency and curative power to an object rather than the lawgiver.
The absurdity is that this practice directly violates Sunnat Allah, the natural law. The Creator established fixed, verifiable laws for medicine, hygiene, and nutrition. Substituting these systematic, rational, and verifiable processes with the ritual consumption of dissolved pigment is an irrational revolt against the lawfulness of creation.
It's shirk because it directs the trustee's essential trust, their tawakkul, away from the active, all-powerful lawgiver and towards a powerless human proxy, the ink, the paper, the ritual itself.
True protection is the systemic reward for adherence to divine law, not proximity to a physical object.
This critique of subtle shirk extends deeply into monotheism in causation, particularly the law of healing in Surah Ash-Shu'ara. And when I am ill, it is he who cures me.
And this is not a denial of science, it's a declaration of ultimate agency. It demands we use the lawful means provided by the Creator's natural laws, medicine, science, nutrition, hygiene, but that the ultimate power to grant regeneration and recovery belongs exclusively to the lawgiver.
So the error, the subtle shirk, is attributing primary curative power to the medicine or the water itself, rather than to the creator who designed that medicine to work within the system of fixed natural laws in the first place.
Exactly.
We have seen how shirk fails on legislative, metaphysical, and intellectual levels. We have to consolidate these findings now by examining the ultimate consequences of legislative shirk, the collapse of the criterion. This section details the comprehensive failure when the divine law is abandoned as the absolute criterion, the furqan.
The most profound condemnation comes from Surah Al-Ma'idah, which delivers a devastating tripartite legal verdict on those who abandon the criterion. The context is often focused on custodians, the religious elite who compromise the supreme standard.
Right. They fear people over the creator, trading away the revelations for petty gains. This is such a powerful allegory for any transient worldly gain, financial benefit, political power, social approval. The act of exchanging the verses means treating the immutable divine law as a negotiable commodity for short-term human gain.
And in doing so, they introduce shirk into the judicial and governing systems. The consequence is threefold, marking a total systemic collapse. First, we see disbelief, or kufr. This is reserved for those who intentionally reject the divine law's authority as the foundation of governance. It's the highest condemnation, denying God's fundamental right to legislate for his creation.
Second comes wrongdoing, zulm. Legislative compromise necessarily leads to oppression, imbalance, and injustice in the application of the law, making them active wrongdoers who damage society.
And third, we find drifting from the path, or fisk. This is a moral departure for those who willingly transgress the boundaries of the law, losing their spiritual and ethical bearing.
So this progression shows that abandoning the divine law begins with intellectual disbelief. Kufr results in social oppression, zulm, and ends in moral drift, fisk. The collapse is comprehensive.
And this total collapse is then visualized using the powerful, stark imagery of perpetual loss, kusran, particularly concerning the fuel of the ultimate confinement.
The fire isn't fueled by wood alone, but by men and stones.
Yes, and that is a terrifying and perfect indictment of idol worship and the elevation of relics or human figures. The very objects they associated with God and relied upon for intercession or ultimate authority will ultimately become the fuel for their eternal confinement and torment.
The idols, the false systems, the proxies, they become the sources of torment, completing the cycle of rebellion. It symbolizes the absolute futility of shirk. The false things you rely on will ultimately betray you.
And the nature of this perpetual loss is defined by that profound metaphor of renewed skins in Surah An-Nisa. The verse says, every time their skins are roasted through, we will replace them with new skins so that they may taste the punishment.
That imagery sounds purely physical, but what does it symbolize in terms of systemic failure?
The skin symbolizes the immediate consequence of an action. So its constant renewal symbolizes the process where every wrong deed, every act of shirk, instantly and perpetually brings its consequence, loss, or pain, because the foundation of order is permanently broken.
So since shirk is the most severe systemic error, the root of all disorder, it guarantees that the cycle of action and painful consequence never ends.
It's the necessary, logical, and just application of divine law. It confirms that the violation of Tawhid is an unresolvable failure within the system of justice.
So to circle back to where we started, the Quranic testimony is unequivocal. Shirk is the one unforgivable sin because it is a total, systemic, rational, and spiritual betrayal. It invalidates the contract of the trustee, the Khalifa, and introduces inevitable systemic corruption, zulm.
And what we have consistently established is that shirk is fundamentally self-inflicted harm. By deviating from the natural order, whether through legislative rebellion or intellectual abdication, we shatter our internal moral compass. We distance ourselves from the life-affirming source of divine mercy and guidance. We choose chaos over order.
The ultimate takeaway here, I think, is that the rejection of Tawhid is fundamentally an intellectual failure, a preference for demonstrable ignorance, be it blind following, superstition, or misplaced loyalty, over revealed certainty. The Quran demands aql, reason, and ilm, knowledge. When we reject that singular authority, we choose intellectual paralysis, which leads inevitably to societal oppression.
This entire deep dive is a mandate for introspection. If absolute singularity of divine authority is a precondition for universal order and justice, then we absolutely must look critically at our own lives.
What one human-made system, what political figure, or what ancestral tradition in your own life demands the scrutiny of your intellect, your authorall, to ensure you are not trading away the singular foundation of truth for a petty temporary gain? The deep dive is only the beginning of that necessary rational exploration.